this morning. So I'm very happy actually to introduce Kenny Iguinio, who is our distinguished guest. He's the academic dean of the Faculty of Arts and Creative Industries at Middle Essex University, London, and also he is the president of the African Theatre Association. He's the founding convener of the African and Caribbean Theatre and Performance Working Group at IFTR, or the International Federation for Theatre Research. Dr. Iguinio is a leading scholar of international theatre and somatic practice. His research and publication interests are in actor and performance training, directing Black British theatre, theatre and performance in Africa and its diasporas. His research and practice interests extend to the Feldenkrais method in health, well-being, and performance training. And in addition to publications in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters, he has also edited a number of books, including Trends in 21st Century African Theatre and Performance in 2011, and 3-volume collection published under the general title Performative Interactions in African Theatre in 2013. And I was delighted to be part of this last book. So our distinguished guest will be speaking about the canon is dead, long live the canon, Britishness and streaming of the African identity on the British stage. So I give the floor directly to our distinguished guest, Professor Kenny.
Thank you, Professor Khalid. Really a delight to be here with everyone this morning. Thank you for inviting me to give this keynote. Are my slides up? All right, so like Professor Khalid said, my title is The Canon is Dead. Long live the canon, Britishness and mainstreaming of the African identity on the British stage. And it's, okay, great, it's up there. So I want to start this paper by reading a quote from Rick Knowles, who says that indeed, 21st century diasporic communities, particularly in their second generation of immigration and beyond, tend to be vibrant, adaptable, and predisposed to intercultural solidarities. And that's Rick Knowles 2010. Contemporary British theatre, like society itself, is a melange of peoples and cultures that often operate on a platform of multicultural exigencies, thus making it difficult to achieve a genuine interdependence of cultures or intercultural solidarities, to borrow Rick Knowles' terms. Because most diasporic communities tend to operate on the margins of British society, their theatres also play from those margins, often as a way of serving the respective communities that those migrant communities represent. This negates the inherent inclination of the diasporic communities represented in these margins, in these marginal spaces, to engage with other cultures in intercultural solidarity in order to better negotiate their place within the British society to which they all belong. As a Black-led theatre company, Talawa Theatre Company's ideological stance is encapsulated in a vital role the company plays in negotiating Black British experience on and off the stage. However, the company owes its success in this role to its responsive and nuanced treatment of the issues involved. For instance, writing in his seminal work on the company, Victor Okebu notes, and I quote, "Talawa fulfills its ideological brief without being propagandist or moralist. Its performances reject a simple analysis of problems opting instead for a more objective interrogation of the issues in question, end of quote. It is therefore this aspiration of engaging society in a continual process of negotiation that is not based on antagonism that stands Talawa Theatre Company apart as a unique Black-led theatre company in Britain today. This view that Talawa engages the British society in negotiating the experience of Black peoples has a clear resonance with Ricknell's position in theatre and interculturalism, where he articulates the commitment, and I quote, to theatrical attempts to bridge cultures through performance, to bring different cultures into productive dialogue with one another on the stage, in the space between the stage and the audience, and within the audience, end of quote. According to Knowles, a necessary first step in bridging cultures and bringing them together in this productive dialogue is to recognize the flexibility that makes a culture vulnerable to other cultures around it. Following from this recognition, however, is the fact that while cultures are not impervious to change, Black culture has to be enacted constantly in different manifestations as it negotiates its place among other cultures. And here, of course, I'm talking about other cultures within the British society. It begins with the assumption that culture, the fluid day-to-day lived realities of specific people in specific places at specific times, exist only insofar as it is enacted, performed into being by the daily and extra-daily ritual and performance activities of individuals and communities as they negotiate their place in the world, end of quote. Consequently, it is this process of enactment that provides the space in which intercultural solidarities are manifested. As a Black-led theatre company, Talawa not only sets out to perform Black British experience into being through its productions, but also to provide a space, both literally and ideologically, for these negotiations to take place. In the rest of this chapter, I examine notions about contestations of Britishness and the African identity on the British stage through the work of Talawa Theatre Company, a foremost Black-led theatre company that is acclaimed for mediating issues of identity and cultural tensions experienced by the African diaspora in Britain. Through their adoption and appropriation of Western, African, and Caribbean canonical texts in production, Talawa provides the artistic, cultural, and political platform for people to explore questions about what it means to be Black and British. Talawa's attraction to classical texts can be seen to derive from their philosophy that the good and the great works from all cultures belong to all. In other words, Talawa Theatre Company see their production of canonical text as an opportunity to show that Black British theatre actors can be judged by the same professional standards as their white counterparts. By so doing, Talawa poses a constant challenge to implied and long-standing discrimination against Black British actors that for a long time made it impossible for them to play dominant roles in mainstream theatre productions. In exploring their reimagining and use of canonical text to stake out a place for enacting the African identity within the mainstream British theatre and culture, I looked to Talawa's 2012 all-Black production of Waiting for Godot to position the company as symbolizing Mike Phillips and Trevor Phillips' confidence in a symbolic and cultural recolonization, and recolonization is in quotes here. So a symbolic and cultural recolonization of Britain by people of African descent through an explosion of Black creativity on the British stage. Using examples drawn from the Talawa's 2012 production of Waiting for Godot, this paper sets out the company's profound contribution to British theatre aesthetics and the redefinition of contemporary British identity through their insightful and cultural articulation of politics of a Black British experience. Talawa's 2012 all-Black production of Beckett's masterpiece, Waiting for Godot, at the West Yorkshire Playhouse in Leeds, also signaled a renewal of the company's commitment to the vision of its founding members, particularly their foundational philosophy that the good and the great works from all cultures belong to all. Talawa's Godot, the first British all-Black production of the play, was directed by Ian Brown, the then West Yorkshire Playhouse outgoing artistic director. In exploring this production of a play, which at its core deals with the subject of what it means to be human, I will also consider the critical reception of the production at venues that, following the run at the Playhouse in February 2012, included the Albany Theatre in London in March of the same year, the Old Rep in Birmingham, Theatre Royal, Winchester, and New Wolsey Theatre in Ipswich. Now, I'd like to kind of give you a brief background about the company itself. So who is Talawa Theatre Company? And I'd like to start with a quote by David Johnson, who writes quite extensively about Talawa Theatre Company for his PhD thesis, and has a book which came out last year on the company, on the history of the company. David Johnson says that the history of Black people on the British stage and their contemporary presence was seldom profiled or rarely discussed in the mainstream. The main change to this was in the development of Black theatre companies in the 1980s. Talawa Theatre Company, emerging in the midst of this and later becoming the longest running of these companies, can be seen to have lent itself to the task of beginning to redress the balance. From their earliest days, Talawa Theatre Company set out to challenge long-held perceptions about Black theatre, Black culture, and Black people in general. From their emergence in 1985-86, and I say 85, if you go on the company's website, for example, they give 1986 as a founding of the company, but actually looking through the archives, the company did start in 1985. That was when they kind of formed and began the process of becoming who they are today. But their first production was in 1986. So from their emergence in 1985-86, Talawa has remained ambitious in their avowed commitment to promoting the profile of Black actors, Black theatre and culture in Britain, in their firm belief in the ability of theatre to reflect and ultimately transform society. Talawa set themselves apart by taking an ambitious production of West Indian, African, and Western classics such as C.L.R. James' The Black Jacobins in 1986. That was their very first production in 1986. And that's the picture you see right there on the left. Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest. Olarotimi's The Gods Are Not to Blame in 1989. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra in 1991. The Road by Wole Soyinka in 1992. And this is just to name a few. There are quite a lot of productions in those early days. They are quite prolific in their productions. Founded in 1985 by the quartet of Yvonne Brewster, Carmen Monroe, Mona Hammond, and Inigo Espiguel, as a response to what they perceived as a lack of representation and creative opportunities for actors of Black and ethnic minority backgrounds in mainstream British theatre, Talawa has grown to become Britain's foremost Black-led theatre company today. Talawa's emergence on the British stage came about due to the provision of culturally specific funding by the Race Equality Unit of the then Greater London Council. And as such, the work that emerged with the company was essentially, and this in quote, essentially Black and political. 3 decades from their founding, Talawa has presented a vast array of seminal productions, from work by award-winning Caribbean playwrights to African and Western classics and new writing. Through their insightful and nuanced articulation of the politics of Blackness, Talawa is able to project a unique view of Britishness, or better still, of a shared humanity and providence through the work that they produce, and thus make a valuable contribution to British theatre and society. The name Talawa is derived from the Jamaican word, which kind of sounds like Talawa. This word Talawa is used to convey a basic sense of being materially strong and tough, but also goes beyond the physical to mean dangerous. Dangerous as in the proverbial Jamaican phrase, me little, but me talawa. In other words, I'm little, but I'm strong, and I'm dangerous. Don't underestimate me. I have argued elsewhere in a chapter I wrote in 2015 that Talawa's choice of name encapsulates a unique philosophy which allows for the astute political and social positioning of the company as not wanting to be seen as part of the establishment, as part of the British theatre establishment, as not wanting just to be seen as part of the establishment, but of having the power associated with being in it in the event that they need to wield it. So they don't want to be seen as part of the problem, but they want to be in the circle. They want to be able to have the power to be able to wield it when needed. I contend in that chapter that it is this philosophical positioning that enables the company to retain the possibility of mobility in many directions and to be able to pick and choose their fights. By adopting this approach, Talawa is able to route backwards and forwards in multiple directions to the global south, in other words, to the West Indies, to Africa and elsewhere, in diasporic communities in the global north as well. So here I'm also talking about global south in the context of the diasporic communities within the global north. So they're able to route in these multiple directions to contribute to a redefinition of the idea of Britishness to include not only Black people, but people of other races and ethnicities as well. Talawa's principal objective since its inception have been to provide a viable platform for nurturing and showcasing Black talents, giving voice to the Black British experience, and cultivating Black theatre audiences, as well as developing mainstream audiences for Black work. In his analysis of these objectives, David Johnson observes that the company's continued determination in exploring and producing canonical texts such as Godot is to bring to the text relevant issues of Black, African, Caribbean, and British life that may be ignored by the wider mainstream British theatre companies. This is against the backdrop of Michael Buffon. Michael Buffon is the current artistic director of Talawa Theatre Company. So it's against the backdrop of Michael's contention that, and I quote, there are idiotic assumptions about Black British culture or about Black British cultural taste that are taking a long time to put to rest, end of quote. And now I go on to look at this all Black production of the play in a bit more detail. It is important to note that there has been previous all Black productions of Godot outside of the UK. In 1957, for example, at the Ethel Barrymore Theatre in New York, at the rehearsal room in Johannesburg in 1962, and that Johannesburg one was directed by Atul Fugard, as well as in 1976 production at the Market Theatre in Cape Town, which was directed by Benji Francis. Speaking about the second South African all-Black production of 1976, Francis recalls, ultimately, Waiting for Godot is a very positive play, which talks about the resilience of human beings. The tree was central to my staging. When it started to sprout leaves in Act 2, that sent a powerful message to the oppressed people. It suggested new life and resolution, an image of hope against all the desolation. Every night, the show received standing ovations. Its impact was monumental. Waiting for Godot provided a powerful metaphor of our struggle, which allowed me to get past the censor and speak to my people, end of quote. Evidently, one of the things that aforementioned production of Godot have in common as a direct reflection of their racial casting is that this is what they say about the oppressiveness of waiting and of being without power. And that's an experience shared by the global majority around the world. Conversely, the Playhouse and Talawa's all-Black production certainly adds to the political significance of the play, but without altering the acknowledged universality of Beckett's masterpiece. Taken together, the circumstances of Talawa's emergence in 1985, their long-standing and ideological objective of showcasing Black talents and giving voice to Black British experience, as well as their well-established status as a Black-led theater company, meant that their all-Black Godot was inevitably bound to hold a unique political significance. But this political significance is not at the expense of Beckett's existential vision that we are all open to abuse, and that's all humanity open to abuse, unsure who we are and where we are going. It is useful to know that Talawa's work is never about anger and opposition. And I quoted Victor Kabwe earlier to talk about that fact that it's not about antagonism to whiteness. And you notice also I've tried to avoid use of that term because we mustn't for people in the global South, we mustn't always talk about self in relation to whiteness where we center whiteness in our discourse. So Talawa's work is never about anger or opposition, but about being astute and Promethean in positioning their work as a marker of their identity and belonging in British society. To borrow a phrase used by Dominic Cavendish to describe the production in his review for the Telegraph, I quote, it says, "The evening feels like a marker rather than a landmark," end of quote. And I've put emphasis on the word marker there, or marker rather than a landmark. Seen from this perspective, Talawa's all-Black Godot as a marker of identity and belonging, it becomes possible to grasp the enormity of what it had to say about race and the Black experience in Britain. However, as I have already noted, this political positioning does not undermine Beckett's masterpiece, but instead it allows Talawa to mark and stake their claim to the text itself in fulfillment of their belief that the good and the great works from all cultures belong to everyone. Crucially, it is Talawa's ideological and political positioning, along with the extraordinary platform that comes with excellent casting and performance of a Beckettian masterpiece, that enabled them to use the production to put to rest some of those idiotic assumptions about Black British cultural taste that Michael Buffon alluded to in the quote I cited earlier. The production's impact in putting some of these idiotic assumptions to rest can be seen in the ready acceptance and overwhelmingly positive reviews that the production received from mainstream theater critics in 2012. For instance, writing in The Observer, Claire Brennan enthused, and I quote, "Like all Brown's productions, Godot is crisp, clear, and assuredly crafted. The rhythms and cadences of Beckett's 1955 English text transmit feelingly in the actors' own West Indian accents. The clarity of the direction and the intensity of the acting fuse. Comedy straight tragedy, or does tragedy straight comedy? Whichever, it's soul scoring stuff." End of quote. Excuse me. Brennan's acknowledgement and affirmation of the significance of the actors' West Indian accents in shaping the production is equally reflected in Cavendish's ebullient comment about recognizing the tang of patois in some of the phrasing. This is in stark contrast to my argument elsewhere that Talawa has not always received the sort of critical attention and acclaim it deserves, and particularly in view of what they stand for as a Black-led theatre company. In the essay I wrote in 2015 on this issue of how the British press kind of vilified Talawa for actors that use the Caribbean patois, I quoted David Johnson's 2001 thesis, in which, while trying to understand why mainstream British theatre critics responded well to Talawa's production of American plays in the early 1900s, in early 1990s, but not to other productions, imagine that, and this is quoting Johnson here, the critics considered the Talawa's performance to be acting rather than copying the voices of their parents, as they may have been perceived to be doing in the Caribbean and African plays. So in a sense, the British critics, when the actors performed an American play where they had American accent, they felt that was acting because they were taking on a new accent. But when they performed either the same play, a different play with the Caribbean patois, they felt, oh, well, it's natural to them to speak that way, so they're not really acting. And quite very dismissive, isn't it? However, by acknowledging the West Indian accent adopted by the actors in their performance of Godot, the critics seem to recognize and accept what they were witnessing as talented acting and not a mere imitation of their parents' accents. Gillian Fisher writes in her review of the production, with Jeremy Cuson in the role of Vladimir, the pensive existentialist musing roll of the tongue in a thick Caribbean accent, his animated burst of dancing with elbows jolting and hip swaying present a protagonist with a background rooted in domestic rhythm and bass. Patrick Robinson, as Estragon, swings his arms and pouts his lips with the air of a belligerent child. His desperation to break free from a never-ending cycle of waiting and his desire for sanctuary can be viewed differently from this position of the displaced. As the two men laugh, play games, argue their constant elaboration upon each other's comments, as the two men laugh, play games, and argue, their constant elaboration upon each other's comments become musical with their extended vowels and upward inflection, end of quote. This represents another way in which the all-Black production helped to dismantle one of those idiotic assumptions about a British theater production or what a British theater production should sound like. So if it didn't sound maybe RP, then it wasn't British. So it kind of dismantled the assumption about what a British production should sound like, as well as its attendant supposition that Black actors are not as talented as their white counterparts because they choose to perform in a West Indian or African accent. However, in helping to put down idiotic assumptions such as those about the ability of talented Black actors to successfully undertake and bring something new to significant roles in a classic like Godot, some of the commentaries and reviews lend themselves to premature triumphalism in the sense that they appear to celebrate Talawa's Godot as evidence of a post-racial utopia to which British theatre had attained with the success of the production. Especially considering that it seemed suddenly possible to adopt the same professional standards in critiquing an all-Black Godot as would be applied to any other mainstream production of the play by white actors. And I think this is, like I said, I think this is quite premature triumphalism, where we assume, oh, well, because suddenly we are accepting these Black actors in these roles, then we're in this post-racial space within British theatre. On the one hand, That mainstream critics view Talawa's production in this way is a phenomenal achievement that speaks to the company's existential aim of nurturing and showcasing talented Black actors who can be judged by the same professional standards as their white counterparts. For example, Cavendish observes that both Jeffrey Kisson as Vladimir and Patrick Robinson as Estragon were terrific, though as the inseparable old-timers. At its warmest, the pair's camaraderie suggests that their character-forming struggle has made them brothers in arms, something that is both about skin color and not at all. And you can see I've added emphasis on something about skin color, but not quite at all about that. Writing about her reason for producing the play, the then artistic director of Talawa Theatre Company, Patricia Compass, notes, as I read and reread it, that is the play, I began to feel that this was a play that talked about a great many experiences that would resonate with Black Britons. It talked about a world where you wait for someone else to tell you where. It talks about a world where you wait for someone else to tell you whether or not your life can improve, of constantly having to negotiate with someone who holds themselves just out of reach. It speaks about having to sleep in a ditch and endure regular beatings, of living in uncertainty and fear. It also explores the power of friendship forged against adversity, yet it also looks at how power makes those who have it insensitive to those they hold power over. End of quote. Patrick Duggan's notes for Talawa's Godot Resource Park include a quote from the play along with an acknowledgement that, of course, there is hope in the play. The tree has 4 or 5 leaves. It is also with this inkling of hope, implied by the presence of the 4 or 5 leaves on the tree, that the first all-Black production of the play in the UK differs from other British productions. In a sense, Talawa's all-Black production offered a counter-reading of a play that is often considered to be about, not to be about anything in particular, or to be about hopelessness and an existentialist quest for illusory meaning of life. However, while the play is not necessarily about anything in particular, in other words, not about blackness, whiteness, or indeed about Britishness, and this is some of the words I use in this paper, it evidently lends itself to the treatment of underlying issues represented by these terms, and of course, many more terms as well. This is amply suggested in Cavendish's statement, which no doubt implies an awareness of Talawa's ideological agenda. Brown's, and this is a Cavendish writing, he says, Brown's boldest stroke lies in the figure of Guy Burgess's hapless Lucky, lucky to the overbearing puzzle, so ghostly pale, you wonder if he's playing white. Also, Patrick Duggan acknowledges this much in his discussion of the play's malleability by citing David Bradby's assertion that Godot has the ability to speak like a parable to the particular conditions of any given social context, but especially to those living within oppressive circumstances. Ironically, Patrick Duggan concludes, and I quote, so while Talawa's all-Black production may offer a mirror to the state of things now, it is doing so because its dramaturgical structure and the conditions of the context in which it is staged, not because of its all-Black cast. So here, this is in the resource part, by the way, that Talawa gave out to schools. Here, what Duggan is arguing essentially is that the Blackness of the characters didn't quite matter as the substance of the play itself. So the canon was more important than those who embodied it. What Duggan appears to forego in his conclusion is the possibility that Talawa's production provides a unique performative lens through which Black people can appraise the state of things within British social, cultural, and political landscape today that is not about anger or confrontation. As a commentary on Britishness, the all-Black production reflects the complexity of contemporary British society. And as Ian Brown, the director, puts it, doing the play with an all-Black cast would produce something quite interesting. I wanted to see what that would do to the play. Brown's curiosity in casting an all-Black Goddard is taken up in Stuart Pringle's review of the play at the Albany Theatre. And he writes, from its first moments, the power of the casting is clear. So you see already, and this is actually countering what Duggan wrote in the resource pack itself. From its first moment, the power of the casting is clear. When Didi asked, why didn't you beat me? The same lot as usual. A history of repression and injustice cannot help but burst forth. Goddard is a play of whips and ropes, of masters and slaves, servitude and subjugation. And though they retain their symbolic universality, here they also take on a very real and disturbing life. Why? Because of the bodies that are on stage. Alfred Hickling observed in his review of the production that a consequence of Talawa's all-Black cast is that inevitably certain lines come loaded with additional significance. Estragon declares, we've lost our rights, to which his companions wearily replies, we got rid of them. Thus, this exchange, through this exchange, the play becomes a drama about subjugation. Like other critics, Hickling acknowledges the apparent talent of the actors, but equally goes on to show an astute grasp of Talawa's ideological politics of Blackness, in contrast to many other critics who seem to focus more on the play itself and the ability of the actors, as exemplified in Duggan's argument that the racial background of actors did not have a fundamental impact on the production of the play. Importantly, though, and this is quoting Patrick Duggan here, importantly, one thing that an all-Black cast can and should highlight is that it is entirely credible and possible to cast a Black actor in a role in a canonical play that is traditionally associated with white performers without fundamentally changing the meaning and the impact of the piece. And that is Duggan here. But actually, I argue that it did fundamentally change the meaning of the play the moment it was cast all Black. And I've quoted already somebody to Hickling to talk about that. The blossoming of the solitary tree in Talawa's Goddard forms part of a wider narrative that paints a picture of hope in the bleak landscape of a play that echoes deepening anxieties about the place, identity, and belonging of Black people in contemporary British society. This narrative is aptly foregrounded in Talawa's use of an all-Black cast for a production. At the same time, it speaks to the company's belief, like I cited before, that the good and the great works from all cultures belong to everyone. And perhaps more importantly, it evokes Talawa's confidence that Black British actors can be judged by the same professional standards as their white counterparts, a possibility attested to by the many accolades that the production recorded. As I contend, attempts to dislocate the fact of Blackness, to borrow a phrase from Frantz Fanon, from the conditions of the context in which it is staged, and to locate the success of the production, primarily in terms of the dramaturgical structure of the play, fails to recognize Talawa's underpinning philosophy, which renders any work they do deeply political. And this, like I said, starts from the very first work of the Black Jacobins, which was deliberately political. So any work that talks about, makes the dramaturgical structure the primary thing, fails to recognize this underpinning philosophy, which renders any work they do deeply political, specifically as a vehicle for projecting the identities and aspirations of Black people on the British stage, notwithstanding the idea that focusing on the Blackness of actors' bodies invariably raises questions about the point at which racial identity gives way to professional competence. In other words, does Talawa's desire for racial embodiment override the material and dramaturgical structure of Beckett's play? And I think no. I think they can all go hand in hand. And in that production, they do go hand in hand. A direct answer to this question would be an emphatic no. In fact, Vicky Ellis notes, for instance, that resonances with African colonial history and to be lost on director Ian Brown's and Patricia Kompa. With the latter, that is Patricia Kompa, noting the experiences ring, noting the experiences ring especially true for the Caribbean setting. These parallels aren't Krubadian, but it sits uneasily well with Beckett's text. However, I hasten to add that Talawa's stance on the projection of Blackness on the British stage retains its relevance until such a time when Black people feel confident to freely proclaim their sense of equality and shared Britishness with their white counterparts, and of course with all other ethnicities in the UK. And that is, I'm talking about within the mainstream of British society, not in the fringes, as often happens, as opposed to simply being identified as a qualifier, Black, British. Why not just British? We often don't talk about white British or, you know. So this is why I consider Duggan's post-racial reading of the play, as well as some tacit acceptance of his view by quite a number of people, following the many positive reviews acknowledging their actors' talented performance, is too ahead of his time. And Talawa tacitly accepts this view as well, because I mean, Duggan wrote this in the Resource Park. So I think it's quite ahead of his time, as the context for grounded as being required for this reading to be wholly valid is not one that is actually in place. We are not yet at this stage of equality or equity. So the actors being Black is still very important and relevant. Talawa not only draw on the play to speak to the idea of a shared humanity and a shared sense of Britishness, but crucially, they equally use it to underscore the idea of getting on with life. And this is really important, the idea of getting on with life, despite the feeling of existing within an interminable liminality and of waiting for the arrival of an utopian post-racial society. After all, we know that in the play, God never arrives. However, in discussing part of our rationale for wanting Talawa to perform Godot in the same year that she was leaving the company, Kompa signifies her feeling that the play, and I quote, talked about a great many experiences that would resonate with Black Britons, of constantly having to negotiate with someone who holds themselves just out of reach, end of quote. Kompa also discusses the company's founding philosophy as instituted by the first artistic director, Yvonne Brewster, which has seen Talawa regularly producing canonical plays that have resonance within mainstream British theatre circuit. Consequently, Kompa acknowledges that her choice of Godot was also a tribute to Brewster, a tribute to Brewster's continuing influence on Talawa. According to her, Ian Brown had immediately seen how the casting would create a fresh way of approaching the play. So to claim that the casting didn't alter the play, I think is quite a tenuous one. Ultimately, Kompa points to a key factor that is also acknowledged by Duggan and many critics who recognize that, and I quote, The quality of Black British acting talent is beyond question. It consisted of a cost-effective 5 actors and 1 set, and so allowed attention to focus on the text and those playing it, an approach I particularly wanted. These 5 parts have never been on offer to Black British actors before, and so I felt we would attract a quality cast who would relish the challenges the play presented. I also felt that the voices the actors will bring to the play would create a different sound, enrich the already poetic rhythm of Beckett's language, and their life experiences will bring depth and richness to the interpretations of Didi and Gogo, Pozo, Lucky, and the boy. Also discussing Talawa's Godo in relation to the history of the company's development, Michael Buffon, who, like I said before, is the current artistic director, knows that, and I quote, "Back then, there was an idea that we needed to explain who we were in this country. Theater was used to explain our past," end of quote. Those years have gone. Black people now are part of Britishness. The way we perform now is much more about how we are part of this society rather than how we got into it. Buffon goes on to observe that Britishness has changed and we are British in a way that is not the same for our parents. It is therefore this understanding that is at the heart of Talawa's Godo. The cyclical nature of Vladimir and Estragon's existence on Talawa's production is such that while their interminable wait for Godot is not without its attendant despair, it nonetheless brings to the fore a host of existentialist ideals about finding oneself and the meaning of life through free will, choice, and personal responsibility. That is more about getting on with life in the moment. Even though it is not uncommon to hear Godot described much in the same way as by the Irish critic Vivian Mercer, who notably designated it as a play in which nothing happens twice, Talawa's production showed a lot can indeed happen within the moment of endless waiting. Brown picked up on this theme in an interview in response to a question about Godot being played in which nothing happens more or less happens. And I quote that quote from Talawa here by the director. Just bear with me, it's a slightly long one. "I think it's a bit of a myth that nothing actually happens that is in the play. It is true to say that a play doesn't have a clear plot because they are waiting and they are waiting for something that doesn't happen, but they do a lot of things while they are waiting. They play games, they play act, they argue, they philosophize, they insult each other. So quite a lot happens. We spend our time watching it with them, waiting for Godot to appear. So as an audience member, you feel involved, you share their frustration, you get to know them. I think you grow quite fond of them. So you have a lot of things to occupy your mind while you're watching it. There are also 3 other characters that come in during the course of the play and entertain us. They give us a lot to think about. More things happen in the play than in a lot of other plays I know. In fact, I'd say it's action-packed. Brown's response points to the idea of getting on with life and living in the moment despite the uncertainty and the ominous sense of despair portrayed in the play. As a Black-led theater company, Talawa is staunchly political. Their aspiration remains to articulate and give voice to the collective experience of Black people in Britain and to continue to develop mainstream audiences for Black work. Talawa's reading of the play does not only take from the idea of a shared humanity that Beckett speaks to, it reinforces the shared humanity of all races and peoples, while at the same time opening up the potential to highlight and explore the unique identity of Black people through the embodied presence and actions of the Black actors on stage. Consequently, Talawa's aspiration of projecting the collective experience of Black people in Britain through the play is first about underlying the idea of a shared humanity and a shared sense of Britishness. According to Pringle, and I quote, "What Talawa Theatre Company prove is this: their 25th anniversary production is that two things do inevitably change: the actors on stage and the world outside the theater, and that Beckett's play is receptive to their magnificent transformative power," end of quote. However, it is also about underscoring the fact of Blackness. Like I talked about, I quoted Franz Fanon before to talk about this fact of Blackness, which is etched in the bodies of the actors, and ultimately using the production to say something about being a Black person in Britain and the importance of getting on with things and not standing still, waiting for the utopian bliss of a post-racial society. In conclusion, I'd like to quote Cavendish, and quote starts with, "It's hard to get very excited about a breakthrough that is long overdue. This is the first all-Black production of Waiting for Godot in UK. Beckett's masterpiece was first presented in English in 1955. The Empire Windrush docked in 1948. About time, you might well think, to see a non-white contingent enter the scene," end of quote. One may indeed try to undermine the role of race or the fact of Blackness in Talawa's Godot, but it is perverse to do so in view of an all-Black cast from a company like Talawa, performing Beckett's classic text on the British stage for the first time. What this evokes is a powerful image that cannot be rendered immaterial. Until we come to that place where it becomes the norm for talented Black actors to perform classic plays and characters that are traditionally associated with white actors, Talawa's production of Godot, indeed any Black production of Godot in the global north, will continue to resonate in its articulation of Blackness. The American and South African all-Black productions mentioned above earlier in this talk highlighted the Blackness of the actors due to the history of racism and apartheid, respectively, in both countries. Again, showing what Beckett has to say about race specifically and the human condition in general. Conversely, Talawa's 2012 production had a lot to say about race in Britain. It had a lot to say about race in Britain, that in Pringle's was celebrates equality in the shadow of ongoing injustices and persistent discrimination. Eventually, the statement that an all-Black production make about race and equality in today's Britain, that Beckett is ultimately arguing for a society in which it is normal for us to see ourselves first as human beings, to see others or the other as an equal, where our shared humanity and contribution to society is more important than the color of one's skin or their racial origin. It is this understanding that is at the heart of this paper, and thus my reading of Beckett's contribution to British culture as seen through the lens of Talawa's 2012 production of Godot. After all, to quote Beckett to end, after all, Godot is hope. Godot is life, aimless, but always with an element of hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for such an inspiring, keynote this morning. I think it's it's a good kickoff for the day. أستاذ كيني طبعا الحال تحدث وأقحمنا في صلب موضوع مسارح العالم أو مسارح الجنوب العالمي، وهو يتحدث عن مسارح الجنوب العالمي في الشمال، يعني انطلاقا من تجربة مسرح طلوة وانطلاقا من إنتاجات مثل في انتظار غودو التي بطبيعة الحال تحدث بل بإسهاب عن يعني الإشكالات المرتبطة سواء بالعرض أو بممثلين أو يعني من أصول أفريقية، وكيف يتمثلون طبيعة الحال هذه المسرحية التي الكل يعتقد أنها مسرحية عبثية لا علاقة بالسياسة، بينما أقحمونا في صلب يعني القضايا الساخنة في بريطانيا، وخاصة القضايا المرتبطة بالأقليات. Thanks so much, Kimi. As I said, you engaged us with a very serious critique of contemporary British theatre, which is somehow a kind of melange of people and cultures, and often operate on a platform of multicultural exigencies, etc. And you also contend that because diasporic communities are often pushed to operate on the margins of British society, and then you gave us a very specific example from Tanawa Black Theatre in Britain, and particularly the production of Waiting for Godot. The way it's transformed, and of course, according to the exigencies of those actors who are not only producing it, but acting in it, but you bring the issue of race, ethnicity. And my question, maybe the first one will be, how can we think about race, ethnicity, and class in terms of an intersectional approach, and particularly because Beckett's Waiting for Godot, it's like a play, and you mentioned that, where nothing happens twice, but definitely this nothingness is reenacted in a completely different way here. So it's not only transposed into a different milieu or environment, but also we they injected a kind of political, I would say, dimension that I can't read in the text itself, when thinking about it as, like a whole structure of waiting. And even if they are doing a lot of things while waiting for Godot, but definitely they are falling into this vicious circle, and they are bringing us again to the ground zero and to start again. And this Godot never comes. And of course, the Pozzo unlucky situation is extremely changing in Act 2, from somebody who is a master and, like a representative of whatever capitalist, etc., into somebody who started in Act 2 with hope. That's the first word pronounced by Pozzo in Act 2. But it's amazing to see the way blackness is playing out within all these fabric.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary of, of the presentation. Actually, you've kind of answered that question yourself. I think one of the things that Godot does is so well is about this whole, and that's what Talawa did. Is about this whole thing about helping to project the idea of power, and how people with power often, for example, thinking about, I'm from Nigeria originally. During elections, you see those people with power, to come back to the class issue. You see them during elections, and then all through the rest of the 4 years are in power. You don't see them. They are there, but they're out of reach, and you can't quite engage with them. And I think what Godot does in relation to class is exactly the same thing it does in relation to race. I mean, just coming back to race a little bit, I think blackness is quite political for a lot of reasons that has to do with the transatlantic racism, with slave trade, racism, and so on and so forth. And I think that because identity is often inscribed in relation to blackness, it's inscribed in the skin. And the moment a black person walks into the room where other racial people from other racial backgrounds are in dominance, their blackness becomes a political statement. And that is what Talawa manages to do with Godot. It's really about saying, well, we want to make a statement about this sense of Blackness. And I think the director put it so well. It's not so much about saying, how did we get into this country? How did we get into, we've done that, we've moved on from there. It's about saying, actually, we are now one fabric with this country, and how can we negotiate our place with the other people from other racial backgrounds. And I think the same applies when it comes to class. One of the things that Talawa does, and I think they do so well with that, is to curate an audience for Black work. In Britain's, England's West End, for example, you find that the theatre is not a preserve for poor people. It's, you know, it's really the middle class and upper class leisure activity. And because Black people have a history of not being permitted into spaces that, you know, were constructed as not for them, they didn't feel comfortable there. One of the things that Talawa does is to try to begin to open up those spaces. And what can we change in those spaces to make it amenable for Black and people of other minorities to feel welcome in those spaces? And that also gives a nod to class, the issue of class.
Well, once again, thank you so much, Kenny, for such a wonderful keynote speech. And definitely I will call Mr. Jamal for chairing the next panel. Thank you so much.